I was sitting in my loader at 6 in the morning on a freezing January day in rural Montana, just outside of Whitefish, watching the snow pile up on my driveway when I saw the flashing red and blue lights coming down the access road. The sun had barely started to rise, and I had been up since 4:30 clearing the massive dump of snow that had fallen overnight. My breath was fogging up the cab windows, and my hands were cold despite the gloves I was wearing. The police cruiser pulled up right next to my property line, and I killed the engine on my John Deere loader, wondering what on earth could have brought law enforcement out here at this ungodly hour. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle, and right behind them came a silver Mercedes SUV that I recognized immediately. My heart sank. It was Karren Vickers, the president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, and she was already gesturing wildly before she even got out of her vehicle. I climbed down from the loader, my boots crunching in the fresh powder, and walked over to meet them. The older officer, a guy with gray hair poking out from under his winter hat, raised his hand in greeting. "Morning. Are you Michael Rossiter?" "That's me," I said, crossing my arms against the cold. "What seems to be the problem?" Karren was out of her Mercedes now, wrapped in what looked like a $1,000 parka, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it probably gave her a headache. "The problem, Michael, is that you are illegally blocking the HOA road with your equipment. You have been warned multiple times about obstructing community access." I blinked at her, genuinely confused. "I'm clearing snow on my own property. I'm not blocking anything." "You most certainly are," she snapped, her voice rising. "That road you keep parking your loader on is HOA property, and we have regulations about commercial equipment on community roads." The younger officer, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, pulled out a notepad. "Sir, can you explain what you're doing here this morning?" "I'm clearing my driveway," I said slowly, pointing to the long stretch of asphalt that led from the main access road to my house. "I've been doing it since I moved here 3 years ago. I own this property, all 15 acres of it, and I have every right to maintain it." Karren let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. "The access road is part of the Pine Ridge HOA infrastructure. You agreed to abide by our rules when you purchased property in this area." "I'm not part of your HOA," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I never signed any agreement, and my property is outside your development." This was an old argument between us. When I had bought this land, I had specifically chosen it because it was not part of the Pine Ridge development. I wanted space, privacy, and the freedom to do what I wanted with my own property. The HOA had been formed by the cluster of expensive homes built about a mile down the road, and Karren had been trying to extend their jurisdiction ever since she took over as president 2 years ago. The older officer held up his hand. "Let's all calm down here. Madam, do you have documentation that shows HOA ownership of this road?" Karren's face lit up like she had won the lottery. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through it with her manicured nails. "Absolutely. The easement was registered with the county in 1998 when the development was established. This entire access road is maintained by HOA fees and is, therefore, HOA property." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. "That's not possible." "The access road crosses my property. I have the survey maps." "Then you should have consulted them before you started blocking community access," Karren said triumphantly. The younger officer looked between us. "Do either of you have these documents on you now?" "They're in my house," I said, pointing up the driveway. "I can get them right now." "I have mine right here," Karren said, holding up her phone. "I can email them to you officers immediately." The older officer, whose name tag Reed Johnson, nodded. Why don't we all head inside somewhere warm and sort this out? Mr. Rossiter, would you mind if we came up to your house? 20 minutes later, we were all sitting in my kitchen. I had started a pot of coffee and the officers were examining the documents spread across my dining table. Karren sat with her phone in hand, occasionally making pointed comments about how I was wasting everyone's time. I had pulled out my original purchase documents, including the detailed survey map that had been done when I bought the property. Officer Johnson traced his finger along the survey map, comparing it to the easement document that Karren had provided. His partner, Officer Martinez, was doing the same thing on his tablet, looking at the county records online. "Here's what I'm seeing," Johnson said finally. According to the county records, there is an easement registered for the access road. However, the coordinates listed in that easement agreement don't match the current road location. Karren's confident expression faltered slightly. "That's impossible. The road has been in the same place for decades." "Actually," Martinez said, looking up from his tablet, "it looks like the original easement was for a road that ran about 200 feet to the east of the current location. The current road appears to have been rerouted sometime in the early 2000s. I felt a surge of vindication. When I had bought this property, my lawyer had been very thorough about checking the survey and making sure there were no encumbrances on the land. So the road that's actually being used crosses my property, not the easement location." Johnson nodded slowly. "That appears to be the case. The HOA may have an easement registered, but if the physical road was moved and no new easement was recorded, then technically they're using your property without authorization." Karren's face had gone pale, then red. "This is absurd. We've been maintaining this road for years. We've paid for snowplowing, repairs, everything." "Madam, that doesn't change the property rights," Martinez said gently. "If the road is on Mr. Rossiter's land and there's no current easement, then he has the right to control access. So I'm not breaking any laws by using my loader on my own property?" I asked, wanting to be absolutely clear. "No, sir, you're not," Johnson confirmed. "In fact, if the HOA has been using your property without permission, that could be considered trespassing." Karren stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against my floor. "This is outrageous. We provide essential access to multiple properties in this area. You can't just block the road." "I'm not blocking anything," I said, standing up as well. "I'm clearing snow on my own driveway, which happens to be where your HOA built a road without proper authorization." The officers exchanged a glance, and Johnson started gathering up the documents. "Here's what's going to happen. Mr. Rossiter, you're free to continue your snow removal. Mrs. Vickers, I suggest you contact the HOA's legal counsel and get this easement situation sorted out. Until then, Mr. Rossiter is within his rights to use his property as he sees fit." "But the other homeowners," Karren protested. "They need access to the main highway. This road is the only way in and out during winter." "That's between you and Mr. Rossiter to work out," Martinez said. "But calling the police to report illegal activity when there isn't any is not the solution." After the officers left, Karren stood in my kitchen, her arms crossed, glaring at me like I had personally orchestrated this entire situation. "You know this is going to cause major problems." "I didn't create this problem," I said evenly. "Your HOA built a road on my property without getting the proper easement. That's on you, not me." "We'll sue," she said flatly. "We'll take you to court and get an easement established through adverse possession. We've been using this road for over 20 years. Actually, according to Montana law, you need to prove open, notorious, exclusive, and hostile use for 5 years, I said. I had looked this up after the last argument we'd had about property boundaries. And since I've only owned this land for 3 years, the clock would have reset when I purchased it and put up no trespassing signs at the property lines. Her jaw clenched. You put up those signs deliberately to interfere with HOA access. I put up those signs because this is my property, and I wanted to mark the boundaries clearly, I said. Look, Karren, I don't want to make your life difficult. I don't care if people use the road. But you can't call the cops on me for maintaining my own property, and you can't act like you have authority over land that you don't own. She grabbed her purse from the counter. This isn't over, Michael. The HOA board will be hearing about this, and we will take action. She stormed out, and I heard her Mercedes start up and speed away down the access road. I poured myself another cup of coffee and looked out the window at my loader, still sitting where I had left it, half a snowbank piled next to it. The whole situation was giving me a headache. My phone rang an hour later while I was finishing up the snow clearing. It was my lawyer, David Morrison, who I had called right after the police left. Michael, I've been looking at the documents you emailed me, he said without preamble. This is actually a pretty interesting case. The HOA definitely doesn't have a valid easement for the current road location. That's what the police said, I confirmed. Karren threatened to sue for adverse possession. David made a humming sound. She can try, but she won't win. Montana requires 5 years of adverse possession, and more importantly, the use has to be without the owner's permission. If you've had no trespassing signs up, that shows you didn't give permission, which defeats the adverse possession claim. So, what happens now? Well, technically you could block the road entirely, David said. But that would cause a lot of problems for the other homeowners who rely on it for access, and it would probably result in lengthy legal battles. My suggestion: negotiate an easement agreement on your terms. I hadn't thought about that. What kind of terms? You let them use the road, but you establish conditions. Maybe they pay you an annual fee for the easement. Maybe they're responsible for all maintenance and snow removal. Maybe you require them to acknowledge in writing that it's your property and you're granting permission. Whatever works for you. And if they refuse, then you're within your rights to restrict access. But I'm guessing they'll negotiate once they realize they don't have legal standing. After I hung up with David, I went back to clearing snow, but my mind was churning. I didn't want to be the bad guy who blocked road access for a bunch of innocent homeowners. But I also wasn't going to let Karren and her HOA board walk all over my property rights just because it was convenient for them. The next morning, I woke up to find a certified letter stuck in my door. It was from the Pine Ridge HOA board, signed by Karren and 4 other board members, demanding that I cease and desist from interfering with HOA infrastructure and threatening legal action if I continued to obstruct the road with my equipment. I called David immediately. He laughed when I read him the letter. "They're bluffing," he said. "They know they don't have standing, but they're trying to intimidate you. Don't respond directly. Let me draft a response outlining your property rights and offering to negotiate an easement agreement." 3 days later, I got a call from an angry man who identified himself as Preston Hughes, one of the homeowners in the Pine Ridge development. "What the hell do you think you're doing, blocking the road during winter?" "I'm not blocking anything," I said, confused. "I've been clearing snow like always." "That's not what the HOA told us. We got an email saying you were preventing road maintenance and that we might lose access if you continued interfering." My blood started to boil. Karren was lying to the homeowners, making me out to be the villain. "Mr. Hughes, I think you need to hear the full story." I explained the situation, the easement issue, the police visit, everything. Preston listened quietly, and when I was done, he let out a long breath. "So the HOA has been using your property without permission this whole time?" Correct. And now they're trying to make it seem like I'm the problem because I won't let them continue to do whatever they want without acknowledging it's my land. Jesus, Preston muttered. Karren told us you were trying to extort money from the HOA. I haven't asked for a single dollar. My lawyer suggested negotiating an easement agreement, but the HOA hasn't even responded to that offer. Can I share this information with the other homeowners? Preston asked. I think people need to know what's actually going on. Please do, I said. I don't want any trouble. I just want to protect my property rights. Over the next week, things escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Several homeowners called me directly, apologizing for the confusion and expressing frustration with how Karren had handled the situation. A few of them even stopped by in person to introduce themselves and thank me for not blocking the road while the legal issues got sorted out. But Karren wasn't backing down. I started noticing her Mercedes driving slowly past my property at odd hours. Then I got another certified letter, this time threatening me with a lawsuit for tortious interference with HOA operations and demanding I pay for retroactive easement fees going back 3 years. David was less amused by this letter. They're grasping at straws. Tortious interference doesn't apply here at all, and they can't charge you for an easement that doesn't exist. I'm going to send them a much firmer response. Things came to a head on a Tuesday morning in early February. I was in town getting supplies when I got a call from my neighbor, an older guy named Frank who lived about a mile west of me outside the HOA area. Michael, you need to get back here. There's a bunch of trucks and equipment on your property. I drove back as fast as the snow-covered roads would allow. When I got there, I found 2 dump trucks, a grader, and a small excavator parked on my land. A crew of 4 workers were in the process of widening the access road, cutting into the trees along the edge of my property. I pulled up and jumped out of my truck. Hey, what the hell are you doing? One of the workers, a middle-aged guy in a reflective vest, looked up from where he was directing the excavator. We're doing road work for the HOA. This is my property and you're trespassing. Who authorized this? He pulled out his phone and showed me a work order. It was signed by Karren Vickers and stated that the crew was to perform maintenance and improvements on the HOA access road. This work order doesn't give you permission to be on my property, I said, trying to keep my anger in check. You need to stop immediately and leave. Look, buddy, we're just doing our job. If you have a problem, take it up with the HOA. I have a problem with you destroying my property, I said, pulling out my own phone. You can either leave voluntarily or I'm calling the police. The crew supervisor looked uncertain. We were told this was all approved. It's not. This is private property and you're trespassing. I called the sheriff's office while the crew stood around awkwardly. Officer Johnson arrived within 20 minutes, along with a younger deputy I hadn't met before. Mr. Rossiter, Johnson said when he saw me. What's going on now? I explained the situation, showed him the property boundaries on my survey map, and pointed to where the crew had already cut down 3 of my trees and gouged a trench through my land. Johnson walked over to talk to the crew supervisor, examining the work order. When he came back, his expression was serious. They were contracted by the HOA to do road work, but they were definitely not informed that this was private property. I'm going to have them cease work immediately. What about the damage they've already done? I asked, looking at the fallen trees and torn-up ground. That's going to be a civil matter between you and the HOA, Johnson said, but I document everything with photos and video. The crew packed up and left, the supervisor apologizing repeatedly and saying he never would have started work if he'd known the property was disputed. After they were gone, I spent an hour photographing and videoing all the damage from every angle. David was livid when I sent him the photos. This is beyond the pale. They committed criminal trespass and property destruction. We're filing a lawsuit immediately, and I'm going to recommend you also file a police report for the property damage. Will that actually go anywhere? I asked. Maybe, maybe not. But it creates an official record. And Michael, we're not just asking for damages now. We're going to seek an injunction preventing the HOA from any further access to your property until an easement agreement is properly established. Won't that hurt the other homeowners? That's the HOA's problem, not yours, David said firmly. They're the ones who escalated this. They could have negotiated months ago. Instead, they chose to trespass and destroy your property. The lawsuit was filed 2 days later. The Pine Ridge HOA and Karren Vickers personally were named as defendants, seeking damages for the destroyed trees and land damage, as well as the injunction preventing further access. Karren called me the day she was served with the lawsuit. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice tight with fury. "You're going to lose everything over this." "You sent contractors to destroy my property without permission," I said. "What did you think would happen?" "That was maintenance on HOA infrastructure. On my land. Without authorization. That's called vandalism, Karren. We'll countersue for everything you've got." "Go ahead," I said, and hung up. The injunction hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, I put up additional no trespassing signs and a chain across the access road where it entered my property. I left a gap wide enough for emergency vehicles, but regular traffic couldn't get through without stopping and moving the chain. The backlash was immediate. I got angry calls from several homeowners who were upset about the access restriction. I patiently explained to each one that this was a direct result of the HOA's actions, not mine, and that I had offered to negotiate an easement agreement months ago. Preston Hughes, who had called me that first time, actually organized a meeting with other homeowners to discuss the situation. He invited me to attend, and I agreed, figuring it was better to face them directly than let Karren control the narrative. The meeting was held at the Pine Ridge Community Center, a nice building at the entrance to the development. About 30 homeowners showed up, along with the 5 HOA board members, including Karren. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Preston started the meeting by laying out the timeline of events as he understood them. He was surprisingly fair, presenting both sides of the issue. When he was done, Karren immediately jumped in. "What Preston has failed to mention is that Michael has been trying to extort this HOA from the beginning. He wants us to pay thousands of dollars for an easement to a road that's been here for decades." "That's completely false," I said, standing up. "I never asked for money." My lawyer suggested negotiating an easement agreement, but we never specified terms because the HOA never responded to the offer. "Because we don't need an easement," Karren snapped. "We already have one." "No, you don't," I said calmly. "You have an easement for a road that doesn't exist anymore. The current road is on my property, and you don't have permission to use it." An older woman in the front row raised her hand. "But if we don't have access to this road, how are we supposed to get to our homes in winter? The alternate route adds 40 minutes in good weather." "I understand that," I said, "and I've never wanted to block access. But the HOA can't just ignore property rights because it's inconvenient. If you want to use my land, we need a proper legal agreement." Another homeowner, a younger guy in a business suit, stood up. "What kind of agreement are you looking for?" I glanced at David, who was sitting near the back of the room. He gave me a slight nod. "Here's what I'm proposing. The HOA can have an easement for the existing road. In exchange, The HOA takes full responsibility for maintenance and snow removal, acknowledges in writing that it's my property, and pays for the damages caused by the unauthorized work done last week. That includes replacing the 3 trees that were cut down and repairing the land that was torn up. "And what about fees?" Preston asked. "I'm not asking for any annual fees," I said. "Just proper acknowledgement of property rights and responsibility for maintenance." There were murmurs throughout the room. Several people were nodding, but Karren looked like she had swallowed a lemon. "This is blackmail," she said. "You're holding our access hostage." "No, Karren, I'm asking for basic respect for property rights. You're the one who's been acting like you own land that you don't." The businessman stood up again. "I'm a lawyer," he said. "And from what I'm hearing, Mr. Rossiter's position is completely reasonable and legally sound. The HOA screwed up by not maintaining the proper easement records, and now we're paying the price. Karren, with all due respect, you should have negotiated months ago instead of taking aggressive action." Karren's face turned red. "We have a responsibility to protect HOA interests." "You have a responsibility to act within the law," the lawyer shot back. "And right now, you're losing in court because you committed trespass and property damage. That's going to cost this HOA a lot more than just negotiating an easement would have." The meeting continued for another hour, with various homeowners asking questions and expressing opinions. By the end, it was clear that most of them were on my side, or at least understood my position. Several of them approached me afterward to shake my hand and apologize for the situation. Karren left without speaking to anyone, her face like thunder. The next day, I got a call from a lawyer named Patricia Simmons, who identified herself as newly retained counsel for the Pine Ridge HOA. "Mr. Rossiter, I've been brought in to resolve this situation. I've reviewed all the documents, and I have to say, I think there's been significant mismanagement on the HOA's part." "That's putting it mildly," I said. "I'd like to meet with you and your attorney to discuss settlement terms. The board has voted to pursue a negotiated easement agreement." "What about Karren Vickers?" There was a pause. "Mrs. Vickers is no longer involved in the negotiations. She's been asked to step back from her role while this matter is resolved." David and I met with Patricia Simmons and 2 HOA board members the following week. Preston Hughes was one of them, having been elected to the board in an emergency meeting after several members resigned in protest of how Karren had handled things. The negotiation was surprisingly straightforward. The HOA agreed to all my terms. They would maintain the road, acknowledge it was my property, pay for the damages from the unauthorized work, and record a proper easement with the county. In exchange, I would grant them the easement and drop the lawsuit. "What about Karren Vickers?" I asked. "Is she facing any consequences?" Patricia looked uncomfortable. "She's been removed as HOA president. The board is still deciding whether to pursue action against her for exceeding her authority. She sent contractors onto my property without authorization and caused thousands of dollars in damage," I said. "That's not just exceeding authority, that's criminal trespass and vandalism." Preston leaned forward. "We're aware. Some of the board members want to distance the HOA from her actions by filing a separate claim against her personally. But that's still being discussed." The settlement was finalized 2 weeks later. The HOA paid $15,000 to cover the damaged trees, land restoration, and my legal fees. The easement was properly recorded with Flathead County, clearly stating that the road crossed my property, and I was granting permission for its use. The HOA took over all maintenance responsibilities, including snow removal, which actually saved me time and effort. I thought that was the end of it, But Karren wasn't done causing problems. In late March, as the snow was starting to melt, I noticed someone had spray-painted "extortionist" on one of my no trespassing signs near the road. Then, one of my trail cameras caught footage of Karren's Mercedes parked near my property line late at night. I called Officer Johnson and showed him the footage. He shook his head. "That's pretty clearly her vehicle. Do you want to press charges?" "Not yet," I said, "but I want it documented." 2 nights later, my trail camera caught her again, this time actually on my property, pulling up survey stakes I had placed to mark the boundary. The footage was clear enough to see her face. This time, I did press charges. Karren was cited for criminal trespass and vandalism. She tried to argue that she was checking the property boundary for HOA purposes, but the video evidence was damning. She was clearly and deliberately removing my property markers. The criminal case moved slowly through the system, but in the meantime, I learned from Preston that Karren had been making increasingly erratic decisions as HOA president before this whole situation blew up. She had allegedly been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including charging her personal vehicle maintenance to the HOA account by claiming they were inspections of HOA property. The HOA board hired a forensic accountant to review the books. What they found was shocking. Over the course of 2 years, Karren had siphoned off nearly $50,000 from the HOA accounts through various fake invoices, inflated contractor bills, and personal expense charges. The board filed a police report, and Karren was arrested in early May. I heard about it from Preston, who called me sounding both relieved and exhausted. "She's being charged with embezzlement, fraud, and theft. The county prosecutor is taking it seriously because of the amount involved." "Jesus," I said. I knew she was difficult, but I didn't know she was stealing from the HOA. None of us did. She was very good at covering her tracks, but once the accountant started digging, it all came apart. She had created fake contractor accounts, inflated legitimate bills and pocketed the difference, even submitted expense reports for gas and meals that never happened. What happens to the HOA now? We're rebuilding. We've elected a new board president, and we're implementing much better financial controls. And honestly, having the easement situation properly resolved has removed a huge liability. Your property could have become a legal nightmare if we'd continued down the path Karren was taking us. The criminal trespass and vandalism charges against Karren were resolved first. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 6 months of probation and ordered to pay restitution for the damaged property markers. It was a slap on the wrist, but the prosecutor told me it was typical for a first-time offense with minimal damage. The embezzlement and fraud charges were much more serious. Karren's trial was scheduled for August, and the prosecutor's office contacted me to testify about the unauthorized work that had been done on my property. Since some of the invoices Karren had submitted to the HOA were related to that incident and had been falsified, the trial lasted 3 days. I testified on the second day, explaining the timeline of events and providing the documentation showing that the work done on my property had been unauthorized. The forensic accountant also testified, walking through a detailed analysis of the HOA's finances and showing exactly how Karren had manipulated the accounts. Karren's defense attorney tried to argue that she had made mistakes in record keeping, but hadn't intended to steal, but the evidence was overwhelming. The fake contractor accounts were particularly damning, especially when the prosecution showed that the bank accounts for those contractors were in Karren's name. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Karren was found guilty on all counts: 8 counts of embezzlement, 12 counts of fraud, and 6 counts of theft. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. I attended the sentencing hearing, partly out of curiosity and partly because the prosecutor had asked me to be there as a victim representative, since my property had been damaged as part of Karren's schemes. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Chen. She listened to the prosecutor's sentencing recommendation of 4 years in prison and 5 years probation, followed by the defense attorney's plea for leniency based on Karren's lack of prior criminal record. Then Judge Chen looked directly at Karren, who was standing at the defendant's table in a conservative gray suit, her face pale and drawn. "Mrs. Vickers, you held a position of trust within your community," Judge Chen said. "Homeowners relied on you to manage their collective funds responsibly and to act in their best interests. Instead, you systematically stole from them for your personal benefit. You falsified documents, created fraudulent accounts, and when confronted with legitimate questions about property rights, you chose to escalate rather than negotiate, causing further damage and expense. This court has no sympathy for your situation. You are sentenced to 3 years in the Montana State Prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are also ordered to pay full restitution to the Pine Ridge HOA in the amount of $48,700 and to Mr. Michael Rossiter in the amount of $2,000 for property damage. You understand this sentence?" Karren nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Your Honor." She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and pity. She had brought all of this on herself through arrogance and greed, but it was still sobering to watch someone's life fall apart. Outside the courthouse, Preston caught up with me. "Thanks for being here. The HOA wanted you to know we appreciate everything you did to expose what was happening." "I was just protecting my property," I said. "I didn't set out to uncover embezzlement." "I know. But if you hadn't stood up for your rights, Karren would have kept going. She would have found other ways to steal and manipulate. You forced everything into the light." We shook hands, and I drove home to Whitefish, watching the mountains rise up around me as I left the city behind. The whole situation had been exhausting and frustrating, but it was finally over. The HOA made good on all their settlement obligations. They paid for the restoration work on my property, including planting 3 new spruce trees to replace the ones that had been cut down. They took over all snow removal on the access road, which meant I could sleep in on snowy mornings instead of getting up at 4:30 to run the loader. The easement was recorded properly, and I never had another dispute about property boundaries or access rights. The new HOA board was professional and respectful, checking with me before doing any work near my property, and even asking my input on some road maintenance decisions since it crossed my land. In September, almost a year after that first morning when Karren had called the police on me for clearing snow, Preston stopped by with a bottle of whiskey and an invitation to the HOA's annual fall barbecue. "You know you're not technically part of the HOA," he said with a grin. "But we figured since you're granting us the easement and the road crosses your property, you're part of the community whether you like it or not." I laughed and accepted both the whiskey and the invitation. The barbecue was held at the community center, and I met dozens of homeowners I'd never talked to before. Many of them thanked me for standing up to Karren and for being reasonable about the easement situation once the legal issues were resolved. One older couple, the Hendersons, pulled me aside. "We want to apologize," Mrs. Henderson said. "We believed everything Karren told us about you at first. We even signed one of those petitions she was circulating to try to force you to grant free access." "It's okay," I said. She was very convincing, and she was in a position of authority. I don't hold it against anyone who believed her. Still, Mr. Henderson said, we should have done our own research instead of taking her word for it. Lesson learned. As I drove home that evening, full of good food and feeling more connected to my neighbors than I ever had before, I reflected on the whole bizarre journey. It had started with me just trying to clear snow from my own driveway and had ended up exposing embezzlement, resulting in criminal convictions, and completely reshaping the HOA's leadership and operations. The next winter, when the first big snow hit in December, I woke up at my usual early hour and looked out the window to see the HOA's contracted plow already clearing the access road. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and watched the sun come up over the mountains, feeling grateful that I had stood my ground when it mattered. The loader sat in my equipment shed, still ready to go if I needed it, but for now it could rest. The road was clear, my property rights were protected, and the community was finally working together instead of fighting. Sometimes standing up for what's right means facing down authority, dealing with police calls, enduring threats of lawsuits, and watching situations escalate in ways you never intended. But in the end, the truth had a way of coming out, and justice had a way of being served, even if it took longer than you'd like. Karren Vickers was serving her sentence at the Montana Women's Prison in Billings, and the last I heard, she was working in the prison library and attending financial responsibility classes as part of her rehabilitation program. I didn't wish her ill, but I didn't feel sorry for her either. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. The Pine Ridge HOA had recovered from the financial damage she'd caused, implementing new oversight procedures and transparency measures that should prevent future embezzlement. Preston had been elected as the permanent board president, and under his leadership, the HOA was actually functioning the way it was supposed to, serving the community instead of trying to control it. As for me, I went back to my quiet life on my 15 acres, enjoying the space and freedom that had made me choose this property in the first place. I kept good relationships with my neighbors, both in the HOA and outside it, and I made sure to keep all my property documents current and accessible, just in case. The access road remained exactly where it was, crossing my property with proper legal authorization, maintained by the HOA, and serving the community. Every time I drove across it, I remembered that morning when Karren had called the police on me for clearing snow, and I smiled at how much had changed since then. The no trespassing signs stayed up at my property boundaries, but now they were respected. The survey markers I'd placed were left alone. The easement agreement was filed with the county and stored in my safe, a permanent record of property rights properly acknowledged and respected. In the end, that was all I had wanted from the beginning: not money, not control, not power over the HOA or its members. Just simple respect for the fact that I owned my land and had the right to control what happened on it. It had taken a police investigation, a civil lawsuit, criminal charges, and a trial to establish that basic principle, but it was worth it. Looking back on the entire experience, I learned several important lessons. First, never assume that just because someone is in authority, they're acting legally or ethically. Karren had counted on people trusting her position and not questioning her decisions. Second, document everything. The survey maps, property records, photos, and video footage had been essential in proving my case. Third, stand firm on matters of principle, but be willing to negotiate reasonable solutions. I could have made things much harder for the HOA if I'd wanted to, but that wouldn't have served anyone's interests. And finally, I learned that sometimes the smallest disputes can uncover much larger problems. If Karren hadn't called the police on me for clearing snow, if she hadn't sent contractors onto my property without permission, the embezzlement might have continued for years. The property dispute had pulled at a thread that unraveled her entire scheme. The community was better off for it, even though the process had been painful and divisive. The HOA was now run honestly and transparently. Homeowners were more engaged and informed about their association's operations. Property rights were clearly established and respected. And perhaps most importantly, people had learned not to blindly trust authority without verification. As spring arrived again, and the snow finally melted away completely, I started planning some improvements to my property. I wanted to build a new equipment shed and maybe add a small workshop. I made sure to check all the zoning requirements and building codes, and I even gave Preston a heads up about my plans, just to maintain the good relationship we'd established. "Sounds great," he said when I called him. "And hey, if you need any help with the construction, let me know." I used to do carpentry work before I retired. That was the kind of neighborly cooperation that should have existed from the beginning. It had taken a long, difficult journey to get there, but we'd arrived at a place where the community functioned on mutual respect rather than authoritarian control. The story of the HOA calling the police on me for clearing snow became something of a local legend in Whitefish. I'd occasionally run into people in town who had heard about it and wanted to know the details. Some of them shared their own HOA horror stories, while others just shook their heads at the absurdity of the whole situation. Officer Johnson, who I still saw around town occasionally, always greeted me with a friendly wave and a comment about how that call had turned into one of the more interesting cases of his career. "Usually, property disputes are boring," he told me once at the grocery store. "But yours had everything: trespassing, embezzlement, fraud, criminal trials. It was like a legal thriller." I laughed and agreed, though I could have done without the stress and drama at the time. My property values had actually increased as a result of the clear property rights and the properly recorded easement. When similar properties in the area went up for sale, my real estate agent told me that having clear, undisputed access and boundaries was a major selling point. Not that I planned to sell anytime soon. I loved my land and my home, but it was nice to know. The 3 new spruce trees the HOA had planted to replace the ones Karren's contractors had cut down were doing well, growing steadily and filling in the gap in the tree line along my property. In a few more years, you'd never know anything had been disturbed there. I made a point of staying informed about HOA activities, attending the occasional board meeting and reading the minutes they published online. Not because I didn't trust the new leadership, but because I'd learned the importance of staying engaged and informed about things that affected my property and community. The relationship between me and the HOA members had evolved into something genuinely positive. I was invited to community events. I helped out when someone needed equipment or expertise with property maintenance, and I was treated as a valued neighbor rather than an adversary. It was how things should have been from the start. Karren's name rarely came up anymore, except occasionally when the HOA discussed the improved financial controls they'd implemented after her crimes came to light. She had become a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when power goes unchecked and greed overcomes integrity. I sometimes wondered if things could have been different if Karren had just responded to that first offer to negotiate an easement agreement. If she had approached the situation with openness and honesty instead of arrogance and aggression, none of the drama would have happened. She'd still be HOA president, the embezzlement would never have been discovered, and my relationship with the community would have been very different. But that kind of speculation was pointless. What happened, happened, and everyone involved had to deal with the consequences, good and bad. As another winter approached and I prepared for the snow season, I looked at my loader with a sense of satisfaction rather than frustration. I could use it on my property anytime I wanted, without fear of police calls or harassment. The access road would be maintained by the HOA, but if I wanted to clear my own driveway, I was free to do so. The whole experience had reinforced my belief in the importance of property rights, honest governance, and standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. It had also shown me that communities work best when they're built on mutual respect and clear communication, rather than assumptions and power plays. I never regretted buying my 15 acres outside of Whitefish, and I never regretted standing firm when the HOA tried to assert control over property they didn't own. The journey had been challenging, but the destination, a peaceful existence on my own land with good relationships with my neighbors, was exactly what I'd been hoping for when I moved to Montana. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging around my property, indifferent to human drama and disputes. They had been there long before the HOA existed, and they'd be there long after all of us were gone. There was something comforting about that perspective, a reminder that most of our conflicts and concerns were temporary and small in the grand scheme of things. But within the scope of our human lives and communities, standing up for property rights and honest governance mattered. It mattered to me, it mattered to the homeowners who had been stolen from, and it mattered as a principle of law and order. As I closed up my house for the night and looked out at the stars brilliant and clear in the Montana sky, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The battle was over, justice had been served, and life had returned to the peaceful rhythm I'd always wanted. The access road crossed my property with my permission, properly documented and legally sound. The HOA functioned honestly and transparently under new leadership, and Karren Vickers was paying the price for her crimes. Sometimes, I reflected, the universe has a way of working things out. Not always quickly and not always easily, but eventually, truth and justice tend to prevail. All it takes is someone willing to stand firm, document everything, and not back down when authority oversteps its bounds. That someone had been me, and while I hadn't asked for the role or wanted the conflict, I was proud of how I'd handled it. I had protected my property rights without being unreasonable, exposed corruption without seeking personal gain, and helped reshape a community organization into something better than it had been. The snow would come again soon, and the cycle would continue. But this time, everything was in order, legal, and agreed upon. This time, there would be no police calls, no angry confrontations, no unauthorized work on my property. This time, the community would function as it should have from the beginning. And that, I thought as I finally headed to bed, was worth all the trouble it had taken to get here.